Captain James Morrison had served the royal family for 15 years. His tall frame stood straight as an arrow every morning at 6 o'clock sharp. His uniform was always perfect, his boots polished until they shine like mirrors. The other guards looked up to him. Everyone trusted him to keep the royal family safe. James loved his job more than anything else in the world. When he was a young boy, his father had been a guard too. His father told him stories about protecting kings and queens. James dreamed of wearing the same uniform one day. When he finally got the job, his father cried with happiness. The palace where James worked was huge and beautiful. It had hundreds of rooms with golden walls and expensive paintings. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls. Red carpets covered marble floors that had been walked on by royalty for hundreds of years. Gardens surrounded the palace with flowers of every color imaginable. Prince Louis was only 8 years old, but he was very smart. He had blonde hair that always looked messy no matter how much his nanny tried to fix it. His blue eyes were always full of curiosity. He asked questions about everything he saw. The prince loved to explore the palace when he thought no one was watching him. James had been assigned to watch Prince Louis for the past 3 years. It was not an easy job. The young prince was full of energy and always wanted to go on adventures. He would hide behind curtains and jump out to surprise people. He would race through the long hallways, making his footsteps echo off the walls. Sometimes he would climb on furniture that cost more money than most people made in a year. But James did not mind. He actually enjoyed spending time with Prince Louis. The boy reminded him of himself when he was young. Prince Louis was kind to everyone he met. He always said please and thank you to the servants. He shared his toys with the children of the palace staff. James had watched the prince grow from a tiny 5-year-old into a curious 8-year-old. The royal family lived their lives according to strict schedules. Every day was planned from morning until night. Prince Louis had breakfast at 8 o'clock. Then, he had lessons with his private teachers until noon. After lunch, he was supposed to have quiet time for reading or drawing. In the evening, he had dinner with his parents if they were not busy with royal duties. But Prince Louis did not like following schedules. He wanted to explore and discover new things. He was always asking James if they could go to different parts of the palace. James tried to keep the prince happy while also following the rules. It was like walking on a tightrope every single day. One Tuesday morning in October, something felt different in the palace. James noticed it as soon as he arrived for work. The other guards were whispering to each other in small groups. When James approached them, they stopped talking and looked nervous. The head butler, Mr. Williams, was walking around with a worried expression on his face. James went to check on Prince Louis like he did every morning. The prince's room was on the 3rd floor of the palace. It was a large room with a 4-poster bed, a desk for studying, and shelves full of books and toys. Sunlight came through tall windows that looked out over the gardens. When James knocked on the door, Prince Louis called for him to come in. The prince was sitting on his bed, still wearing his pajamas. But something was wrong. Usually, Prince Louis would jump up and run to greet James with a big smile. Today, he just sat there looking sad and confused. "Good morning, Your Highness," James said with a bow. "Are you ready for breakfast?" Prince Louis looked up at James with his big blue eyes. There were tears starting to form, but he was trying hard not to cry. "James," he said in a quiet voice, "can I tell you a secret?" James felt his heart skip a beat. In all his years of service, Prince Louis had never looked so serious. The boy was usually laughing and planning some kind of mischief. James sat down in a chair near the bed so he would be at the same level as the prince. "Of course, Your Highness," James said gently. "You can tell me anything." Prince Louis looked around the room as if he was making sure no one else was listening. Then, he moved closer to James and whispered, "Last night, I could not sleep. I heard voices coming from my father's office. I wanted to see who was there." James felt a cold feeling in his stomach. The king's office was in a part of the palace where Prince Louis was never allowed to go. It was where important government business happened. James was supposed to make sure the prince stayed away from areas like that. I know I am not supposed to go there, Prince Louis continued. But I was very quiet. I hid behind the big statue in the hallway. No one saw me. James wanted to tell the prince that he should not have been there, but something in the boy's voice made him stay quiet and listen. There were 3 men in the office with my father, Prince Louis said. His voice was getting even quieter. They were wearing dark suits and they looked very serious. I had never seen them before. Prince Louis paused and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. James could see that whatever the prince had witnessed had really scared him. They were talking about money, the prince continued. A lot of money. They said my father owed them something. They said bad things would happen if he did not pay them back. James felt his blood turn cold. This sounded very serious. He had been trained to protect the royal family from physical dangers, but this sounded like a different kind of threat. Did you hear anything else, Your Highness? James asked carefully. Prince Louis nodded. One of the men said they knew about my mother's visits to the doctor. He said they knew she was very sick, but no one else knew about it. He said they would tell everyone if my father did not do what they wanted. James felt like the room was spinning around him. The Queen had been sick? He had noticed that she seemed tired lately, but he thought it was just from her busy schedule. The royal family was very private about personal matters. If the Queen was seriously ill, it would be kept secret from the public. The man also said something about papers, Prince Louis whispered. He said my father had signed something that could get him in big trouble. He said other countries would be very angry if they found out. James realized he was holding his breath. This was much more serious than he had imagined. If Prince Louis had really witnessed a blackmail attempt against the king, it could mean danger for the entire royal family. What happened next? James asked. My father looked very scared, Prince Louis said, and now the tears were flowing down his cheeks. I have never seen him look like that before. He always seems so strong and brave. But last night, he looked like he wanted to cry. James reached out and gently patted the prince's shoulder. He could see how much this had affected the young boy. Children were not supposed to see their parents looking weak and frightened. The men said they would give my father 1 week to decide, Prince Louis continued. They said if he did not agree to help them, they would ruin our family. Then, they left through a side door. Prince Louis looked up at James with his tear-filled eyes. James, what does this all mean? Are we in danger? Is my mother really sick? Why was my father so scared? James felt his heart breaking for the young prince. No 8-year-old should have to worry about these kinds of adult problems. But, at the same time, James realized that Prince Louis might have witnessed something that could help protect the royal family. Your Highness, James said carefully, what you saw last night was very important. You were very brave to tell me about it. But, I was not supposed to be there, Prince Louis said. Am I in trouble? No, James said firmly. You are not in trouble. Sometimes being in the wrong place at the wrong time can actually help people. You might have learned something that could keep your family safe. James stood up and began pacing around the room. His mind was racing with thoughts about what he should do next. He was just a guard, but he had just learned about a serious threat to the royal family. Should he tell his superior officers? Should he go directly to the king? Should he try to investigate the mysterious men himself? James? Prince Louis called out. What are we going to do? James looked at the young prince sitting on his bed in his pajamas. The boy was depending on him to make everything better. James had sworn an oath to protect the royal family with his life. Now he had information that could help him do that job better than ever before. First, James said, we need to make sure you are safe. Then, we need to figure out how to help your father without letting those bad men know that you saw them. Prince Louis wiped his eyes and sat up straighter. I want to help, he said with determination. This is my family, And I want to protect them too. James smiled for the first time that morning. Despite his young age, Prince Louis had the heart of a true royal. He was willing to be brave even when he was scared. "All right, Your Highness," James said. "But we have to be very careful and very smart about this. Can you promise me that you will only talk to me about what you saw? We cannot tell anyone else until we figure out what to do." Prince Louis nodded seriously. "I promise, James. I trust you." As James helped Prince Louis get dressed for the day, his mind was already working on a plan. He needed to learn more about the men who had threatened the king. He needed to find out if the queen was really sick. And he needed to do all of this without alerting anyone that Prince Louis had been a witness to the blackmail attempt. The rest of the morning passed like a strange dream. James followed Prince Louis to breakfast, but he barely noticed what was happening around him. He watched the king and queen carefully, looking for signs of stress or illness. The king seemed tired and distracted. The queen was smiling and talking normally, but James thought he could see something sad in her eyes. During the prince's lessons, James stood guard outside the classroom as usual. But, instead of thinking about potential physical threats, he was thinking about the mysterious men in dark suits. Who were they? What did they want the king to do for them? And what would happen to the royal family if the king refused to cooperate? When lunchtime came, James made an excuse to check the king's office. He told the other guards that he wanted to look for any signs that someone had tried to break in during the night. What he was really looking for was evidence of the meeting that Prince Louis had described. The office looked normal, but James noticed something strange. There was a faint smell of cigarette smoke in the air, but the king did not smoke. James also saw that some papers on the desk had been moved around. There were coffee stains on the table that had not been there the day before. These small details convinced James that Prince Louis had been telling the truth. The meeting with the mysterious men had really happened. Now James had to decide what to do with this dangerous information. As the afternoon went on, James noticed more strange things happening in the palace. Several servants seemed nervous and jumpy. The head of security had extra guards posted at all the entrances. Even the kitchen staff seemed quieter than usual. When evening came, James helped Prince Louis get ready for bed. The young prince had been unusually quiet all day. As James tucked him into bed, Prince Louis grabbed his arm. "James," he whispered, "I keep thinking about what I saw. I am scared for my family." James sat down on the edge of the bed. "I know you are scared, Your Highness. I am scared too. But we are going to figure this out together. Tomorrow, I am going to start looking for ways to help your father." "What if those men come back?" Prince Louis asked. "If they come back, I will be ready for them," James said firmly. "I promise you that I will not let anyone hurt your family." Prince Louis seemed to relax a little bit. "Thank you, James. I am glad you are here to protect us." After Prince Louis fell asleep, James walked slowly through the palace halls. Everything looked the same as it always had, but now he saw it all differently. Behind the beautiful walls and expensive decorations, there were secrets and dangers that he had never imagined. James thought about his father, who had also been a royal guard. His father had always told him that protecting the royal family was about more than just standing guard and watching for obvious threats. Sometimes the most dangerous enemies were the ones you could not see. As James made his final rounds of the night, he made a decision. Tomorrow, he would begin his own investigation into the men who had threatened the king. He would use every skill he had learned in his 15 years of service. He would be careful and smart, but he would not give up until he found a way to protect the royal family from this hidden danger. The palace grew quiet as midnight approached. James stood at his post outside Prince Louis's room, but his mind was far from quiet. He was already planning how he would track down the mysterious blackmailers and find out what they really wanted. What James did not know was that the men in dark suits were also making plans. They had noticed the extra security around the palace. They suspected that someone might have overheard their conversation with the king. and they were prepared to do whatever it took to keep their secret safe. The stage was set for a dangerous game between James, who wanted to protect the royal family, and the mysterious men, who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. Prince Louis, with his innocent witness to their threats, was at the center of it all. As James stood guard through the long night, he could not have imagined how quickly everything would change. In just a few days, his world would be turned upside down, and he would face the greatest challenge of his life as a royal guard. The next morning started like any other day, but James felt like he was walking through a minefield. Every shadow seemed suspicious, every conversation might contain hidden meanings. He had barely slept the night before, his mind racing with plans and worries about how to protect Prince Louis and investigate the mysterious men. James arrived at the palace an hour earlier than usual. He wanted time to observe everything carefully before his duties with Prince Louis began. The morning shift of guards was just starting their rounds. James watched them closely, wondering if any of them had noticed anything unusual the night of the secret meeting. As he walked through the corridors, James paid attention to details he had never noticed before. Which servants had access to the king's office? Who cleaned that area of the palace? Who would have keys to the side door that the mysterious men had used to leave? Every person he saw became a potential source of information or a possible threat. The head of security, Colonel Harrison, was a man in his 50s with gray hair and sharp eyes. James had always respected him, but now he wondered how much Colonel Harrison knew about the situation. Should James tell him what Prince Louis had witnessed? Or could Colonel Harrison himself be involved somehow? James decided to test the waters carefully. When he encountered Colonel Harrison near the king's wing of the palace, James mentioned that he had noticed some unusual activity in the area lately. Unusual how? Colonel Harrison asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. Just some different smells, moved papers, that sort of thing, James replied casually. Probably nothing, but I thought you should know. Colonel Harrison nodded slowly. Good observation, Morrison. We can never be too careful. Keep your eyes open and report anything else you notice. James could not tell if Colonel Harrison's response meant he knew about the secret meeting or if he was genuinely concerned about security. This was going to be more difficult than James had hoped. When it was time to check on Prince Louis, James found the boy already dressed and sitting by his window. Prince Louis was staring out at the gardens, but James could tell his mind was somewhere else entirely. Good morning, Your Highness, James said gently. Prince Louis turned around quickly, as if he had been startled out of deep thoughts. Oh, James. I was thinking about yesterday. About what I told you. Have you remembered anything else? James asked. Prince Louis nodded. I remembered something about one of the men. He had a scar on his hand, right here, he said, pointing to the space between his thumb and first finger. And he wore a ring with a red stone in it. This was exactly the kind of detail James needed. A scar and a distinctive ring would help him identify the man if he saw him again. James made a mental note to ask around discreetly about anyone matching that description. That is very helpful, Your Highness, James said. You have a good memory. During breakfast, James watched the royal family more carefully than ever before. The king seemed distracted, often staring at his food without eating it. Several times, James saw him glance nervously toward the windows, as if he expected to see someone watching the palace. The queen appeared to be trying hard to act normal, but James noticed small signs that supported what Prince Louis had overheard. She moved more slowly than usual, and there were dark circles under her eyes that makeup could not completely hide. When she thought no one was looking, her smile would fade and she would touch her stomach gently, as if she was in pain. Prince Louis barely touched his breakfast. He kept looking back and forth between his parents with worried expressions. James could see that the weight of keeping such a big secret was hard for an 8-year-old to bear. After breakfast, James had an idea. He asked Prince Louis if he would like to take a walk through a different part of the palace today, somewhere they did not usually go. James wanted to get a better look at the area where the secret meeting had taken place. Can we go near Father's office? Prince Louis asked quietly. We can walk through that general area, James replied. But We have to be careful not to disturb anyone who might be working there. As they walked through the halls, James kept mental notes about everything he saw. There were several ways someone could enter and exit the king's office without being seen by the main guards. The side door that Prince Louis had mentioned led to a corridor that connected to a service entrance used by cleaning staff and delivery people. James also noticed security cameras in some areas, but not all. The area near the side door had a blind spot where someone could walk without being recorded. This suggested that whoever had arranged the meeting knew the palace layout very well. While Prince Louis pretended to be interested in some paintings on the wall, James examined the doorframe of the side entrance. He found small scuff marks that could have been made by shoes, and a tiny piece of fabric caught on the door handle. These were signs that people had used this entrance recently. "James," Prince Louis whispered, "there is the statue I hid behind." James looked at the large marble statue of a former king. It was positioned perfectly to provide a hiding spot with a clear view of the office door. James felt proud of Prince Louis for being so clever, even though the situation was dangerous. As they continued their walk, James began forming a plan. He needed to find out more about the men who had threatened the king, but he could not do it during his regular working hours when he was responsible for watching Prince Louis. He would need to conduct his investigation during his time off. That evening, after Prince Louis was safely in bed, James changed into civilian clothes and left the palace. He had decided to visit some of the places in the city where information could be bought and sold. If the mysterious men were involved in blackmail, someone in the underground world might know about them. James started at a pub called the Crown and Anchor, located in a rough part of the city. It was the kind of place where criminals, ex-police officers, and private investigators sometimes gathered to share information. James had been there a few times before when he needed to track down people who had made threats against the royal family. The pub was dark and smoky, filled with the kind of people who preferred to keep their business private. James ordered a beer and found a seat where he could observe the other customers. He was looking for someone who might be willing to talk about recent criminal activity involving blackmail or threats against important people. After an hour of careful listening to conversations around him, James approached a man he recognized as a former police detective named Murphy. Murphy had been forced to retire after being caught taking bribes, but he still had connections throughout the criminal underworld. "Murphy," James said, sitting down at the man's table. "I need some information." Murphy looked up with bloodshot eyes. "Morrison, right? You are one of those royal guards. What brings you to a place like this?" "I am looking for information about 3 men who might be involved in blackmail," James said quietly. "One of them has a scar on his hand and wears a ring with a red stone." Murphy's expression changed slightly, becoming more alert. "That is pretty specific. What makes you think I would know anything about that?" "Because you hear things," James replied. "And because I am willing to pay for good information." Murphy took a long drink of his beer while he thought. Finally, he leaned forward and spoke in a low voice. "There have been rumors lately about a new group operating in the city," Murphy said. "They are not local criminals. Word is they came from somewhere else, maybe even from another country. They are supposed to be very professional, very dangerous." "What kind of operations?" James asked. "Political stuff," Murphy replied. "Blackmail, information gathering, pressure tactics. The kind of work that requires inside knowledge about important people." James felt his heart rate increase. This sounded like it could be connected to the men who had threatened the king. "Have you heard anything specific about them targeting government officials or important families?" James asked. Murphy glanced around the pub nervously before answering. "I heard they have been asking questions about certain high-profile people. Medical records, financial information, personal secrets. The kind of stuff that could destroy someone's reputation if it became public." "Do you know where I might find these men?" Murphy shook his head. "They do not socialize with the local crowd. But I heard they might be staying at one of the expensive hotels downtown. The kind of place where rich foreigners stay when they are doing business in the city." James thanked Murphy and paid him for the information. As he left the pub, his mind was racing with possibilities. If the men were staying at a hotel, he might be able to find them. But what would he do then? He was just one guard against what sounded like a professional criminal organization. The next morning, James felt exhausted from his late-night investigation, but he forced himself to focus on his duties with Prince Louis. The prince seemed to sense that something was happening. "Did you find anything out?" Prince Louis asked quietly as James helped him get dressed. "I learned some things that might be helpful," James replied carefully. "But I need to be very careful about what I do next." "I want to help," Prince Louis said firmly. "This is my family that is in danger." James looked at the young prince's determined face. Despite his age, Prince Louis had shown remarkable courage and intelligence. But James could not risk putting him in more danger. "The best way you can help right now is to keep acting normal," James told him. "If the bad men think someone knows about their plans, they might do something dangerous." During the morning lessons, James stationed himself where he could see both Prince Louis and the corridor outside the classroom. He was more alert than ever, watching for any signs of unusual activity in the palace. Around noon, James noticed something that made his blood run cold. A man in a dark suit was walking through the main hall, accompanied by one of the palace administrators. The man was well dressed and looked respectable, but James recognized something about his way of walking and the way he held his hands. James moved closer, pretending to adjust his position for better security coverage. As the man turned slightly, James saw exactly what he had been looking for: a scar between the thumb and first finger, and a ring with a red stone. One of the men who had threatened the king was back in the palace, walking around openly in broad daylight. James felt a surge of panic. If this man was here during the day, it meant he had legitimate access to the palace somehow. This was much worse than James had imagined. The threat was not just external criminals trying to break in. Someone inside the palace was helping them. James watched as the man and the administrator walked toward the administrative wing of the palace. He needed to follow them, but he could not leave Prince Louis unprotected. This was the impossible situation that every bodyguard feared, being forced to choose between investigating a threat and maintaining immediate protection. James made a quick decision. He sent a message to another guard, asking him to take over watching Prince Louis for 30 minutes. James claimed he had an urgent security matter to investigate. It was not exactly a lie. Following at a distance, James tracked the man in the dark suit through several corridors. The palace administrator was treating him like an honored guest, showing him around and pointing out various features of the building. James could not get close enough to hear their conversation, but the man seemed very interested in the layout of the palace. They stopped outside the king's office, and James saw the man look around carefully, as if he was memorizing the location of security cameras and guard positions. This confirmed James's worst fears. The man was conducting surveillance, probably planning for future meetings or possibly even planning something more dangerous. When the tour ended, James saw the administrator shake hands with the man and escort him toward a main exit. James had to make another quick decision: should he follow the man outside the palace, or should he confront the administrator about who the visitor was? James chose to follow. He needed to know where this man went when he left the palace. Perhaps he could find out where the group was staying or what their next move would be. James followed the man to a taxi waiting outside the palace gates. The man got in and the taxi drove away quickly. James memorized the license plate number and watched which direction they went. Then, he hurried back to check on Prince Louis. When James returned to the classroom, he found Prince Louis looking anxious. The prince had noticed that James was gone and had been worried. "Where did you go?" Prince Louis whispered when James approached. "I saw one of the men from that night," James whispered back. "He was here in the palace, walking around like he belonged here." Prince Louis's eyes went wide with fear. "What does that mean?" "It means they have help from someone inside the palace," James said grimly. "Someone is giving them information and access." The rest of the day passed in a blur of worry and planning. James realized that he was facing a much more complex situation than he had originally thought. There was not just an external threat to investigate. There was also a traitor somewhere inside the palace walls. That evening, James made another difficult decision. He needed help, and he needed it from someone he could trust completely. He decided to confide in his closest friend among the guards, a man named David Chen who had been working at the palace almost as long as James. James asked David to meet him privately after their shift ended. They met in a small park near the palace, where they could talk without being overheard. "David," James said, "I need to tell you something very serious, and I need your help." James told David everything: Prince Louis's discovery, the blackmail attempt, the investigation, and the appearance of one of the criminals in the palace that very day. David listened with growing amazement and concern. "James," David said when the story was finished, "this is incredibly dangerous. If these people find out that Prince Louis witnessed their meeting, they might hurt him to keep him quiet." "I know," James replied. "That is why I need your help. I cannot protect Prince Louis and investigate this threat at the same time." David agreed to help, but he made James promise to be extremely careful. They developed a plan where David would take over some of James's duties with Prince Louis at certain times, allowing James to continue his investigation. They also agreed that if the situation became too dangerous, they would go directly to Colonel Harrison, regardless of whether they could trust him completely. The safety of Prince Louis had to come first. As James walked home that night, he felt slightly less alone in facing this challenge. But he also felt the weight of responsibility more heavily than ever before. Not only was he trying to protect Prince Louis from physical harm, but he was also trying to save the entire royal family from a sophisticated blackmail scheme. The mysterious men had made one mistake: they had underestimated the intelligence and courage of an 8-year-old prince. But James knew that if they discovered their mistake, they would stop at nothing to correct it. The real test of his abilities as a protector was just beginning. 3 days later, everything changed in ways that James could never have predicted. The morning started with an emergency meeting for all senior palace staff. James was not included in this meeting, but he could tell from the tense expressions on everyone's faces that something serious was happening. David Chen approached James during their lunch break with disturbing news. "I overheard part of the meeting," David said quietly. "Someone has been leaking information about the royal family's private activities to outside sources." James felt his stomach drop. This confirmed his worst fears about having a traitor inside the palace. "What kind of information?" "Details about the Queen's medical appointments, the King's private meetings, even Prince Louis's daily schedule," David replied. "Colonel Harrison is conducting a security review of all staff members." James realized that his own investigation might soon be discovered if Colonel Harrison started looking closely at everyone's activities. But, more importantly, this meant that the blackmailers had even more access to the royal family's private information than James had thought. That afternoon, James noticed that Prince Louis seemed unusually quiet and withdrawn. During his tutoring session, the prince kept glancing toward the windows and jumping at small sounds. When James asked if everything was all right, Prince Louis shook his head. "I heard my parents arguing last night," Prince Louis whispered. "My father was saying that he could not wait any longer to make a decision about something. My mother was crying." James felt a chill run down his spine. The deadline that the blackmailers had given the king was approaching. In just a few days, they would expect an answer about whether he would cooperate with their demands. "Did you hear what they were arguing about specifically?" James asked gently. "My father said he would not let anyone hurt our family, but he did not know how to protect us," Prince Louis replied. "My mother said she was scared about what would happen if people found out about her illness." James realized that the royal family was falling apart under the pressure of the blackmail threat. The king was torn between protecting his family's secrets and refusing to give in to criminal demands. The queen was suffering both from her illness and from the fear of public exposure. And Prince Louis was watching his parents struggle without understanding why. That evening, James made a decision that would change everything. He could not continue to investigate alone while the royal family suffered. He needed to take direct action, even if it meant putting himself in danger. James had obtained the license plate number of the taxi that had taken the scarred man away from the palace. Using his connections with former police officers, James had traced the taxi to a luxury hotel in the center of the city. Now he was going to confront the blackmailers directly. James waited until late at night, when his duties at the palace were finished. He changed into dark clothing and made his way to the Hotel Imperial, a five-star establishment where wealthy international visitors often stayed. The hotel lobby was elegant and dimly lit, with marble floors and expensive artwork. James positioned himself in the hotel bar, where he could observe the elevator and the main entrance. He ordered coffee and pretended to read a newspaper while watching for any sign of the men who had threatened the king. After 2 hours of waiting, James saw him, the man with the scarred hand and the red stone ring. He was sitting at a corner table with two other men in expensive suits. They were speaking in low voices and occasionally looking at documents that one of them kept in a leather briefcase. James moved to a position where he could hear parts of their conversation without being noticed. What he heard made his blood run cold. "The king is running out of time," one of the men was saying. "If he does not agree to our terms by tomorrow night, we proceed with the exposure plan." "What about the boy?" asked the man with the scar. "Are we certain he did not see anything that night?" "Our source in the palace says there is no indication that anyone knows about our meeting," replied the third man. "But we should be prepared for all possibilities." James felt his heart racing. They were talking about Prince Louis, and they were planning to move forward with their threats very soon. But, even worse, they had mentioned our source in the palace. Someone inside was definitely helping them. "The medical records we obtained will be enough to destroy the royal family's reputation," the first man continued. "Once the public learns about the Queen's condition and the King's attempts to hide it, their credibility will be finished." James learned that the Queen was suffering from a serious illness that, if made public, would cause a scandal because the royal family had hidden it from the people. The blackmailers wanted the king to provide them with state secrets or access to government information in exchange for keeping the Queen's illness private. As James continued listening, he realized the full scope of the criminal operation. These men were not just random blackmailers. They were working for a foreign intelligence service, trying to gain access to national security information through blackmail and pressure. "Tomorrow we make contact again," the scarred man said. "If the king refuses, we release everything to the media within 24 hours. James had heard enough. He needed to get back to the palace immediately and warn someone about what was going to happen. But, as he stood up to leave, disaster struck. One of the men at the table looked in his direction and their eyes met. James saw recognition flash across the man's face. Somehow, the man knew who James was. "That is him," the man said to his companions, pointing at James. "That is one of the royal guards." James realized that he had been identified, probably through photographs provided by their inside source at the palace. His cover was blown, and now he was in immediate danger. James tried to walk calmly toward the hotel exit, but the three men were already getting up from their table. They moved to block his path, and James saw that other people in the hotel bar were also standing up. The criminals had more people with them than James had realized. "Captain Morrison," the scarred man said with a cold smile as he approached James. "How nice to see you here. Are you perhaps interested in our business discussion?" James knew that he was trapped. There were at least 6 men surrounding him, and they were all larger and probably armed. The hotel staff seemed to be looking the other way, which suggested that the criminals had paid them to ignore what was happening. "I think there has been a misunderstanding," James said, trying to remain calm. "I am just here for a drink." "No misunderstanding at all," the scarred man replied. "You have been asking questions about us around the city. You followed our associate when he visited the palace. You are conducting an unauthorized investigation." James realized that his amateur detective work had been noticed and tracked. These men were professionals, and they had been watching him just as carefully as he had been watching them. "The question is," another man said, "what are we going to do about this problem?" James understood that he was in serious physical danger. But his main worry was not for his own safety. If these men harmed or kidnapped him, there would be no one left to protect Prince Louis and warn the royal family about the approaching deadline. Before you do anything, James said desperately, you should know that other people are aware of your activities. If something happens to me, it will only make things worse for you. The scarred man laughed. Captain Morrison, you have been working alone. Our source tells us that you have not reported your investigation to your superiors. You have confided only in Guard Chen, and we are prepared to deal with that problem as well. James felt terror wash over him. Not only did they know about his investigation, but they also knew about David's involvement. Their inside source had been providing very detailed information about palace security personnel. You are going to come with us, the scarred man continued. We have some questions about palace security procedures, and you are going to answer them. James realized that they were planning to kidnap him and force him to reveal information that would help them carry out their threats against the royal family. This was exactly the kind of situation he had been trained to avoid, but his desire to protect Prince Louis had led him into a trap. As the men moved closer to him, James made a desperate decision. He could not escape, but he might be able to create enough of a disturbance to attract attention from outside the hotel. James suddenly shouted at the top of his voice and knocked over several tables as he tried to fight his way toward the exit. The commotion caused other hotel guests to stop and stare. Some people took out their phones and started recording. The criminals realized that their quiet operation was turning into a public scene. In the confusion, James managed to break free and run toward the hotel lobby. He could hear the men chasing after him, but he had gained a few seconds of advantage. James burst through the hotel's front doors and onto the busy city street outside. James ran as fast as he could toward the nearest police station, but he could hear car engines starting behind him. The criminals were pursuing him in vehicles, and James knew he could not outrun cars on foot. Just as James thought he was going to be caught, he saw a police patrol car at a red light. James ran directly to the car and banged on the window, shouting that he was in danger and needed help. The police officers were confused but responded to the emergency. When they saw several men in expensive cars apparently chasing James, they called for backup and began questioning everyone involved. James identified himself as a royal guard and claimed that he was investigating threats against the royal family. The criminals claimed that James had been harassing them and making false accusations. Without clear evidence, the police could not determine who was telling the truth. After 2 hours of questioning at the police station, both James and the criminals were released. The police said they would investigate further, but James knew that the criminals would disappear long before any real investigation could begin. James returned to the palace near dawn, exhausted and shaken by his experience. He had learned crucial information about the blackmailer's plans, but he had also exposed himself and put David in danger. Worst of all, the criminals now knew that someone was actively investigating them. When James arrived for his morning duties with Prince Louis, he found the prince waiting for him with anxious eyes. "James, you look terrible," Prince Louis said. "What happened?" James sat down heavily in a chair. He realized that everything was about to come to a crisis point, and he might not be able to protect Prince Louis from what was coming. "Your Highness," James said quietly, "I think we need to tell your father what you saw that night. The bad men are planning to hurt your family very soon, and I cannot stop them by myself." Prince Louis nodded seriously. "I have been thinking the same thing. My father needs to know that someone is trying to help him." James made the most difficult decision of his career. He was going to break protocol and approach the king directly with information obtained through Prince Louis's unauthorized witnessing of a private meeting. It could end his career, but it might save the royal family. "Can you arrange for me to speak privately with your father today?" James asked. "Yes," Prince Louis replied. "I will tell him that you have something very important to discuss about my safety." As James prepared to reveal everything to the king, he did not know that the criminals had already set their final plan in motion. They had decided that James and Prince Louis both knew too much to be allowed to remain free. While James had been at the police station, they had been making arrangements to eliminate both threats to their operation. The palace was about to become a battlefield, and James would face the greatest test of his abilities as a protector. Everything he had trained for during his 15 years of service had led to this moment, when he would have to choose between following rules and saving lives. The meeting with the king was arranged for late that afternoon. Prince Louis told his father that Captain Morrison had discovered something important about his safety and needed to speak privately with him. The king, already stressed from the pressure of the blackmail situation, agreed to the meeting immediately. James had spent the entire day preparing what he would say. He knew that he was about to reveal that he had allowed Prince Louis to break palace rules, that he had conducted an unauthorized investigation, and that he had endangered himself and, potentially, the royal family by confronting dangerous criminals. But he also knew that this might be the only chance to save everyone. The king's private study was a smaller, more comfortable room than his official office. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, and a fire crackled in the fireplace. When James entered, he saw immediately how much the stress had affected the king. The man looked like he had aged 10 years in the past week. "Captain Morrison," the king said, gesturing for James to sit down. "Louis says you have important information about his safety." "What is this about?" James took a deep breath. "Your Majesty, I must first confess that I have violated several protocols in the course of my duties. But I believe the information I have learned is critical to protecting your family." The king's expression became more alert. "Continue." James told the entire story from the beginning. He explained how Prince Louis had been unable to sleep and had wandered to an area where he should not have been. He described what the prince had witnessed, and how James had decided to investigate the threat instead of reporting it immediately. As James spoke, he watched the king's face change from surprise to fear to anger to something that looked like relief. "So Louis heard the entire conversation?" the king asked when James finished. "Yes, your Majesty. He knows about the threats against your family, about the Queen's illness, and about the demands these men are making." The king stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the gardens where Prince Louis often played. "I have been trying so hard to protect him from all of this. I thought that if I could handle it quietly, he would never have to know that his family was in danger." "Your Majesty," James said carefully, "Prince Louis is braver and more intelligent than many adults give him credit for. He has been carrying this secret for days because he wanted to help protect his family." The king turned back to face James. "What you did was completely against protocol, Captain Morrison. You should have reported this immediately to Colonel Harrison or directly to me." "Yes, your Majesty. I am prepared to accept whatever consequences you decide are appropriate. However," the king continued, "your investigation has provided us with information that we desperately needed. We now know much more about these criminals and their methods." James felt a small surge of hope. Perhaps he had not completely destroyed his career after all. "Tell me exactly what you learned at the hotel," the king commanded. James repeated everything he had overheard about the criminals' deadline, their plans to expose the Queen's illness, and their demands for state secrets. He also told the king about their inside source at the palace. The king's face grew dark with anger when he heard about the traitor among the palace staff. "Do you have any idea who this inside source might be?" "No, your Majesty, but they seem to have detailed information about security procedures and staff activities. It has to be someone with significant access." The king sat back down and put his head in his hands. "Captain Morrison, I am going to tell you something that I have not told anyone else. The demands these criminals are making. I cannot comply with them without betraying my country. But if I refuse, they will destroy my family's reputation and possibly endanger the Queen's life." James remained silent, understanding the impossible position the king was in. "The Queen's illness is very serious," the king continued. "If the stress of a public scandal worsens her condition, it could kill her. But the information they want me to provide would compromise national security and put many other lives at risk." "What kind of information do they want?" James asked. "Military defense plans, intelligence about our allies, economic information that could be used against our country," the king replied. "They are definitely working for a hostile foreign power." James realized that this was much bigger than a simple blackmail scheme against one family. This was an attack on the entire nation, using the royal family's personal crisis as leverage. Your Majesty, James said, based on what I overheard, they plan to contact you again tonight for your final answer. And they mentioned that if I or Prince Louis become too much of a threat, they are prepared to eliminate that threat. The king's eyes flashed with fury. They threatened my son? Not directly, but they know that Prince Louis witnessed their original meeting. If they decide that he is a danger to their operation. The king stood up abruptly. This ends tonight, Captain Morrison. I will not allow these criminals to threaten my family any longer. What do you plan to do, Your Majesty? I am going to call Colonel Harrison and tell him everything. Then, we are going to set a trap for these blackmailers when they come for their answer. James felt both relief and fear. Relief that the king was finally taking decisive action, but fear about what the criminals might do when they realized their scheme had been discovered. Your Majesty, there is something else you should know. They have been watching me since I started investigating them. They might be watching the palace right now. As if summoned by James's words, there was a knock on the study door. A palace aide entered with an urgent expression. Your Majesty, the aide said, there is a situation developing. Several unauthorized individuals have been spotted near the palace grounds, and Colonel Harrison requests your immediate attention. The king and James exchanged alarmed looks. The criminals had made their move sooner than expected. Captain Morrison, the king said, your first priority is to ensure Prince Louis's safety. Take him to the secure room on the 4th floor and stay with him until this is resolved. James saluted. Yes, Your Majesty. But, as James left the study, he realized that the situation was rapidly spinning out of control. The secure room the king had mentioned was designed to protect the royal family during emergencies, but James was not sure that anywhere in the palace was truly safe if the criminals had help from someone inside. James found Prince Louis in his tutoring room, where he was supposed to be studying mathematics. But, instead of focusing on his lessons, the prince was staring out the window with a worried expression. James, Prince Louis said as soon as he saw him, there are strange men in the gardens. I saw them from the window. James looked outside and felt his heart sink. There were indeed several men in dark clothing moving through the palace grounds. They were not making any attempt to hide, which meant they were confident they could accomplish whatever they had come to do. Your Highness, James said, we need to go to a safe place right now. As they hurried through the palace corridors toward the 4th floor, James could hear sounds of commotion from other parts of the building. Alarms were beginning to sound, and he could hear the voices of other guards organizing a response to the intrusion. But, when they reached the secure room, James made a horrifying discovery. The door was already open, and inside the room were 2 men in dark suits. One of them was the scarred man from the hotel. Captain Morrison, the scarred man said with a cold smile, how nice of you to bring Prince Louis to us. You have saved us the trouble of searching the entire palace. James immediately stepped in front of Prince Louis, his hand moving to his weapon. But, before he could draw it, he heard footsteps behind them. 2 more men had appeared in the corridor, blocking their escape route. I think you will find that resistance is pointless, the scarred man continued. We have control of the palace security systems, thanks to our friend on the inside. James realized that their inside source had not just been providing information. The traitor had actively helped the criminals infiltrate the palace and disable its defenses. What do you want? James demanded. We want Prince Louis to take a little trip with us, the scarred man replied. He has seen and heard too much. But, do not worry, Captain Morrison. If the king provides what we have asked for, the prince will be returned safely. James understood that they were planning to kidnap Prince Louis and use him as additional leverage against the king. This was exactly what James had sworn to prevent with his life. Prince Louis is under my protection, James said firmly. You will have to go through me to take him. That can be arranged, the scarred man said, nodding to his companions. What happened next seemed to occur in slow motion. The 2 men behind James moved forward to grab him. James spun around and managed to strike one of them, but the other got hold of his arm. At the same time, the men in the secure room moved toward Prince Louis. Run, Your Highness! James shouted. Prince Louis, showing the same courage and quick thinking that had led him to witness the original meeting, immediately darted between the men and ran down the corridor. He was small and fast, and for a moment it looked like he might escape. But the criminals had planned for this possibility. As Prince Louis rounded a corner, he ran directly into Colonel Harrison, who was standing in the middle of the hallway. James felt his world collapse as he realized the truth. Colonel Harrison, the head of palace security, was the inside source who had been helping the criminals all along. "Well done, Your Highness," Colonel Harrison said to Prince Louis with a false smile. "You have led us quite a chase." James fought desperately against the men holding him, but they were too strong and there were too many of them. He could only watch helplessly as Colonel Harrison took hold of Prince Louis. "Let him go!" James shouted. "He is just a child." "A child who knows too much," Colonel Harrison replied coldly. "Do not worry, Captain Morrison. If everyone cooperates, Prince Louis will not be harmed." But James could see in Colonel Harrison's eyes that the man was lying. The criminals had decided that Prince Louis was too dangerous to be allowed to live, regardless of what the king did. In that moment of desperate clarity, James made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He could not save himself, but he might still be able to save Prince Louis. James suddenly stopped struggling against the men holding him and pretended to collapse from exhaustion. As they loosened their grip slightly, thinking he had given up, James gathered all his strength and broke free. Instead of trying to escape, James charged directly at Colonel Harrison, tackling him and causing him to release Prince Louis. James shouted to the prince, "Go to your father. Tell him it's Colonel Harrison." Prince Louis ran as fast as he could toward the king's wing of the palace, while James fought desperately to buy him time. James knew he could not win against so many opponents, but every second he could delay them was another second for Prince Louis to reach safety. The last thing James saw before being overwhelmed was Prince Louis disappearing around a corner, hopefully on his way to warn the king about the traitor who had been trusted to protect the royal family. When James woke up several hours later, he was in the palace medical facility. His head was bandaged and his body ached from the fight, but he was alive. David Chen was sitting in a chair beside his bed. "James," David said with relief, "thank God you are awake." "Prince Louis," James said immediately. "Is he safe?" David smiled. "He is safe." He reached the king and told him everything about Colonel Harrison. The king called in the military, and they arrested all the criminals, including Harrison. James felt overwhelming relief wash over him. "And the royal family?" "They are all safe," David assured him. "The king has decided to be honest with the public about the queen's illness." It turns out that when people learned the truth, they supported the royal family more than ever before. The attempted blackmail actually brought the country together. James lay back against his pillow, finally, allowing himself to relax. What will happen to Colonel Harrison? He is facing charges for treason, conspiracy, and attempted kidnapping, David replied. It turns out he had been taking money from foreign agents for years, providing them with information about the royal family and palace security. And the men who were blackmailing the king? They were all arrested. The information they had collected has been secured, and their foreign intelligence operation has been shut down. James felt proud that his investigation, despite all its mistakes and dangers, had ultimately helped protect the royal family and the country. "James," David continued, "the king wants to see you as soon as you are feeling well enough." 2 days later, James was called to the throne room for a formal ceremony. His uniform had been cleaned and pressed, and, despite his injuries, he stood as straight as he could. The entire royal family was present, including Prince Louis, who beamed with pride when he saw James enter the room. "Captain James Morrison," the king began in a formal voice, "you have served this kingdom with extraordinary courage and dedication. Your actions in protecting my son and uncovering a serious threat to our national security deserve the highest recognition." The king presented James with a medal for exceptional bravery and announced that he was being promoted to the position of head of palace security, replacing the traitorous Colonel Harrison. But, for James, the greatest reward came when Prince Louis approached him after the ceremony. "James," the prince said, "thank you for keeping me safe. You are the bravest person I know. James knelt down to the prince's level. Your Highness, you were the one who was truly brave. You saw something important, you told someone you trusted, and, when danger came, you did exactly what needed to be done. You helped save your entire family. Prince Louis smiled. We made a good team. James smiled back. Yes, Your Highness. We did. As James looked around the throne room at the royal family, safe and reunited, he felt that his father would have been proud. James had done more than just follow orders and stand guard. He had used his intelligence, his courage, and his dedication to protect the people who had been entrusted to his care. The blackmail scheme had been defeated, the traitor had been exposed, and the royal family was stronger than ever. Prince Louis had learned that even children could make a difference when they were brave enough to do what was right. And James had learned that sometimes the most important part of being a protector was knowing when to break the rules in order to serve a higher purpose. His collapse after the revelation had not been from weakness, but from the overwhelming relief of knowing that his sacrifice had saved the life of the young prince he had sworn to protect. The palace returned to its normal routines, but everything was different now. The royal family was more open with the public, the security procedures were stronger, and the bond between James and Prince Louis had been forged through shared danger and mutual trust. Years later, when Prince Louis became king himself, he would often tell the story of the brave guard who had risked everything to protect his family. And James, though he never sought recognition for his actions, became a legend among palace guards as an example of what it truly meant to serve with honor and courage. The secret that Prince Louis had overheard had nearly destroyed his family, but, in the end, it had made them stronger and brought them closer together. And James Morrison, the royal guard who had collapsed from the weight of protecting such a dangerous secret, had proven that sometimes one person's courage and determination could change the fate of an entire kingdom.